Good morning. The Lord be with you. We are at Psalms 8 and 9 today. Even though Psalm 9 is a part of Psalm 10, or they go together as one psalm originally, it seems. We'll get to that in a little while when we get to Psalm 9. But so far we have had a wisdom psalm, Psalm 1, a royal psalm, Psalm 2, and then 5 lament psalms, Psalms 3 through 7. And now we come to a new psalm, the first time in Psalm 8 that we have had this type of psalm, a psalm of praise, a hymn or a song of praise. It's entirely directed to Yahweh. No other persons are directed, though other people are mentioned, but it is spoken directly to God by the psalmist. And it begins with those famous words, O Lord, our Lord, how excellent is your name in all the earth. That's the King James Version. My NRSV says, O Lord, our sovereign, how majestic is your name in all the earth. So it also ends with the very same words. Verses 1 and 9 are identical. They form an envelope or an inclusio, a kind of parenthesis around the psalm, and they also highlight the main content of the psalm, which is the excellence or majesty of the name of God in all the earth. It's a psalm about God and about the creation and our place in the creation as part of the glory of what God has made. Well, let's look into it a little deeper. So, O Lord, our sovereign, how majestic is your name in all the earth. Your name refers always to the character of God. The name of God refers to the kind of God God is, and we've had plenty of opportunities so far in the lament psalms especially to have highlights of the character of God related, especially God's justice, God's sovereignty, God's power, God's glory, God's righteousness, that is God's fierce determination to put all things right. Which is how I understand the term, the righteousness of God. So here the psalmist begins extolling the glory, the majesty, the excellence of the name of God in all creation, not just on the earth, but as you have seen because you've read the psalm already and studied it in your commentary and maybe even worked on the study questions, I hope, that you have had a chance to see how this psalm is about all of creation and about the majesty and glory of God in that creation. The most interesting problem in the psalm is verse 2. The second half of verse 1 says, You have set your glory above the heavens. And if you skipped verse 2 and went straight to verse 3, it makes good sense. You have set your glory above the heavens, and when I look at the heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars that you have established, and so forth. So you could go right from the end of verse 1 to verse 3 and have no lapse of meaning, no gap, no oddity of unconnection there. It connects beautifully. But Psalm 8 verse 2 introduces a kind of problem, which you've discovered if you've used your commentary. Here's what the NRSV says, out of the mouths of babes and infants, you have founded a bulwark because of your foes, to silence the enemy and the avenger. Well, a bulwark is a defensive fortress fortification. It's a powerful, strong wall of defense against foreign invaders, against enemies. The oddity is that the psalmist thinks that whatever babes and infants say, is a bulwark against God's enemies, against your enemies, the enemy and the avenger. Perhaps also the enemy and the avenger of God's people, but here I think it means God's enemies and God's so-called avengers. It's out of the mouths of babes and infants that you have founded a bulwark because of your foes. The Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Old Testament, here of the Psalms, has the word praise instead of bulwark. You out of the mouths of babes and infants you have established praise because of your foes, to silence the enemy and the avenger. Well, either way, it's a little problematic, isn't it? One of the ways to solve the problem, and it was the way that the Monday study group came up with this morning when we met, the 12 of us who met this morning, discussed this verse, and it's the conclusion, general conclusion was that even the humblest creatures among us, babes and infants, because of their laughter, because of their babbling, because of their learning speech, that this weak and innocent form of human expression, even in its weakest form, is used by God as a defense against God's foes. Paul says something similar in 2 Corinthians chapter 12, when God told him that God's power was made perfect in weakness. Here in Psalm 8, even the praise or the speech of infants is enough to defeat God's foes. Even the weakest. Think of 1 Corinthians chapter 1, in which God says that not many wise, not many powerful were chosen to be recipients of the gospel in Corinth. Not the wise and powerful, but the foolish and the weak and the poor were special benefactors of God's goodness, God's good news. God chose the weak things to overcome the powerful. And so here, out of the mouths of babes and infants, God has ordained a defensive bulwark against God's foes. Even the weakest things, the most innocent, least sophisticated weapons are enough in God's arsenal to overcome any evil opposition. God shows up in God's weakness. The cross would be the best example of that, wouldn't it? God's saving the world through God's weakness on the cross, through crucifixion, through suffering, through death. God overcomes and takes upon himself the sins of the world, and through the resurrection brings about new life for us all. Well, that's the best we could do. Maybe you can do better with verse 2. We go on to verses 3 and 4. When I look at the heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars which you have established, what are human beings that you are mindful of them, and mortals that you care for them? Again, I'm using the NRSV. Your translation may have slightly different words. Well, here we might think that the psalmist, perhaps David, it says a psalm of David. We don't know in any of these cases really what the direct connection with David was. Someone asked today whether this psalm was spoken before or after David became king. We simply don't know even what connection with David it had at all. Maybe it was a psalm for David, a psalm connected some way with the other psalms of David. Let's leave that aside. But it is interesting perhaps to imagine that when David was a shepherd boy, he was out tending the sheep at night in the fields, watching over them and looking up at the magnificent Milky Way, all of the glorious stars, the moon in all of its phases, its rising and its setting, its different colors with the different seasons of the year. He was marveling at the glory, the majesty of God in all that God had made. God made the heavens. In fact, he calls them your heavens. We don't tend to look at the heavens that way today and think of them as God's heavens. We just think of them as billions and billions of stars out there, and our small place in all of that cosmic vastness. David looks up at the stars and he thinks of them as God's heavens, the moon and the stars which you have made. He sees it as a part of the presence and creative energy and glory of God to have created this natural wonder that we see at night. But that's not the main point, is it, of verses 3 and 4? The main point is that in the glory and vastness and beauty and wonder of all of the stars and the moon that we look upon, what are human beings that you care for them, that you visit them, that the psalmist recognizes our small place in this vast universe and the wonderful, unexpected perspective that comes when we understand that God visits us, God cares for us, God is mindful of us, when we are just small creatures in the vastness of God's universe. So when I look at the moon and the heavens and all of these things that God has made, what are human beings that you are mindful of them? And in the Hebrew, and the Son of Man, another way of saying mere human beings. This is synonymous parallelism, isn't it, in verse 7 or verse 4? What are human beings that's paralleled by mortals or Son of Man in the Hebrew. You'll find that in a footnote if you're using the NRSV. And mindful of them is paralleled by care for them. So God upholds us and cares for us, for all people. This is not just for the Hebrews, not just for the Israelites, but in the vastness of all God's creation, the psalmist says, isn't it amazing that God also cares for us mere human beings? This whole idea of mere humanness is going to come up at the end of Psalm 9. It's actually my favorite verse in Psalm 9. At the very end, we'll hear about mere human beings in a different context indeed. All right, so then he says that over this glorious creation that God has made, God has given human beings dominion or responsibility. The word dominion comes from the Latin word dominus, which is the normal word for Lord. So we are given lordship over all of God's creation. God alone is the Lord. It's his heavens, and he owns the cattle on 1,000 hills, another psalm will say. All of God's creation belongs to God, but God has appointed humans to have regency over all the creation, to be as caring for God's creation as if God were doing it God's self. Dominion does not mean domination. It does not mean abuse or exploitation. It doesn't mean we can do with animals and with the created world anything we want to. It means that we are charged with a stewardship over all the creation, to care for it as God cares for us, to be the Lord of creation as the Lord is a Lord to us and to all of God's creatures. The psalmist was marveling that God visits us and cares for us and is mindful of us. And then he tells us that we're to have that same kind of mindfulness and care and concern for all creation that God has put under our feet. He says, you have made human beings a little lower than Elohim. The Hebrew here has Elohim. Elohim is the plural word for God. It's the normal word behind all of the mentions of the word God in the Psalms and in the Old Testament. Elohim, the plural form of El, the word for God that you see in El Shaddai, El Elyon, and so forth. The plural Elohim normally refers to God, and so the NRSV translates it, but you have made us as human beings a little lower than God. It can also, though, mean other divine beings, and that's how some commentators treat it, that there's a hierarchy here of God, sovereign over all things, then the divine beings, which would include angels and other supernatural powers, in fact, maybe even other gods, as they do show up in other psalms. And then under them, a little lower than them, you have made us, humans, adults and infants and so forth. You have made humans, and then under humans, all the animals and the created order. A kind of hierarchy that Robert Alter in his commentary shows that this may be in the psalmist's mind. Psalmist also may be having Genesis 1:26 through 28 in mind, and maybe the whole first chapter of Genesis, in which God creates the moon and the stars and all of the animals. So this psalm could be a commentary in its own way on Genesis chapter 1. So you have made us human beings a little lower than God or the divine beings. Hebrews, which was using the Septuagint, the book of Hebrews in the New Testament, which was using the Greek translation of the Old Testament, says a little lower than the angels. And it was you thinking in terms of the person of Christ, who for a short time was made human, a little lower than the angels, as Hebrews puts it, but eventually God will put all things under Christ's feet, including all angels and other spiritual beings. So take a look at that passage I think I referred to in the study questions from Hebrews. It's enlightening as to how it was interpreted later in New Testament times. So we are given dominion over all creation and are to exercise that dominion in light of the praise of God for the created order. So our stewardship is a stewardship that recognizes, that's done in a spirit of prayer and praise. Psalm 8. We turn to Psalm 9. There's some interesting things here about Psalm 9. Psalm 9 is one psalm, probably was originally one psalm before it was broken apart into two chapters in the Greek translation of the Old Testament called the Septuagint, which is often abbreviated as LXX, the Roman numerals for 70. There's a story behind that. You can look it up. Just look it up on Wikipedia. That would be the quickest way, probably, if you don't know what the Septuagint is and what the LXX stands for and why 70. But so anyway, this Greek translation of the Old Testament has Psalms 9 and 10 as one psalm, not two, all one psalm. And furthermore, the evidence that it was originally one psalm is that it is an acrostic. That is, every other line of this double psalm is in a new letter of the Hebrew alphabet. So Aleph, Beit, verse 2, Gimel, verse 3, Dalet, verse 4, and so forth, all the way through the Hebrew alphabet. Each pair of verses, every other verse is, for most of the psalm, in an acrostic written alphabetically in the beginning of each of the lines with a new letter of a succeeding letter of the Hebrew alphabet, an acrostic psalm across both Psalms 9 and 10. It's broken in the middle at the letter K or Kaf, preceding Lamed, which begins in Psalm 10. Now there's more to it than that, because the acrostic gets broken in the middle and stops being an acrostic in chapter 10, in Psalm 10, but then ends with the last three letters of the Hebrew alphabet. So something happened in the textual tradition that the psalm was disrupted in some way that we have no way to recover and don't know why. But the psalm as we have it was one psalm, an acrostic. And further, another interesting thing about Psalms 9 and 10 is that Psalm 9 is really a psalm of praise and thanksgiving to God for what God has done in the past. It speaks about God's being the just judge over all the earth and having put all God's enemies in their places and rescued and redeemed and saved God's people. It speaks about victory and God's goodness and accomplishments in the past, that God has rescued and saved us and delivered us, and how thankful we all are for that. And there are some petitions that God would continue to do so, but it's not a lament. But Psalm 10 is. And as one of the commentators, Craig Broyles, says, and I'll read that a little bit to you. Craig Broyles says here, but what a contrast these psalms form. Psalm 10 is a lament. Psalm 10 is a lament and appears to contradict the praises of Psalm 9, almost point by point. In Psalm 9, the conflict is past and was staged between the speaker, the I, and the wicked nations, implying international battles. But in Psalm 10, the conflict is present and staged between the wicked and the helpless members of the people of Israel, implying some kind of social oppression within the nation, not against foreign enemies, but within the nation, between the poor who are suffering at the hands of the oppressive rich. Well, I think Broyles points out some of the interesting contrasts of these two psalms. Let's look briefly at Psalm 9. Begins with words of thanksgiving. I give thanks to the Lord with my whole heart. I tell of your wonderful deeds. I will be glad and exult in you. I will sing praises to your name. Look at the all four clauses begin with I. I think it's helpful to understand that the I here is not the isolated individual like you and me praying this psalm as a separate individual. This is likely the priest praying this psalm, praying this word of thanksgiving in the context of a worship service in the temple in Jerusalem. And speaking not on his own behalf as a private individual, but speaking on behalf of the whole people of God. You could change the I to we and make very good sense of it. We give thanks to God. We tell of your wonderful deeds. We will be glad and exalt you. We will praise and sing praises to your name, O Most High. When our enemies turned back, they stumbled and fell before you, for you have maintained our just cause. You have sat on your throne, giving righteous judgment. You have rebuked the nations. You have destroyed the wicked. Notice that this fits very well in terms of the whole people of God giving thanks for national deliverance, rather than a private individual giving thanks for having personal enemies defeated. It reads, I think, much better in terms of a national context rather than, or a community context at least, rather than a private individual giving thanks for deliverance from his or her own enemies. These enemies in verse 6 have vanished in everlasting ruins. Their cities have been rooted out. The very memory of them has perished. Take account of the Hebrew poetry characteristic of hyperbole here. Probably not all the enemies have all vanished and all been forgotten, or why would Psalms like this and the words of the prophets still be cited? But it's as if God has so powerfully overcome the foes that the memory of them has perished from the earth. So great has been God's deliverance of God's people. God is pictured here as one who sits upon his royal throne for judgment. Verse 7, as a judge who judges the world with righteousness. That is, God is fiercely determined to put all things right. That doesn't mean fiercely determined only to do what Israel wants God to do, because God also judges Israel itself, just as God judges our nation, and including all the nations of the earth. God sits as a righteous judge, judging all the world in his righteousness, and he judges the people with equity, that is, with true justice, and not with bias. But God does have a bias, and that's a bias for the oppressed. Verse 9 tells us God is a stronghold for the oppressed, a stronghold in times of trouble, and those who know your name, Lord, the character of your name. Remember, Psalm 8 taught us a lot about the glory and majesty of God's name in all the earth. Those who know your name, your character, what you are really like, put their trust in you, and because, Lord, you have not forsaken those who seek you. That's a wonderful verse, too, that we can always claim at any time. Normally, we talk about these passages in their original context as best we can discover them in ancient Israel, or reasonably speculate about them, but some of the verses just seem to jump right out at you, don't they, and come into your own heart and your own life. And I think this is one of those verses. Verse 10, those who know your name, who know what you're like, put their trust in you. You have proved yourself trustworthy, and your people put their trust in you. For you, O Lord, have not forsaken those who seek you. Seek the Lord while he may be found. Call upon him while he is near. Let the wicked forsake their ways, and the unrighteous their thoughts. And this is quoting from Isaiah. So this whole idea of seeking the Lord, it doesn't even say finding. It just says seeking. It's like fishing. Fishing is not called catching. It's called fishing. And it's a different disposition toward the activity. Here the activity is seeking the Lord, seeking God's face, as it's sometimes said in the Psalms. So we are called upon to seek the Lord, because he doesn't forsake anyone who seeks him. That seems to apply very directly to us, as well as to the whole people of God. Because of that, the people of God are called to sing praises to the Lord who dwells in Zion, and we are to declare his deeds among the people. God avenges the suffering of his people and does not forget the cry of his afflicted. And so the psalmist asks God to be gracious to him, that is, the people. If you're thinking of it as a community praise, the community is saying, be gracious to us, O Lord. See what we suffer from those who hate us. You are the one who lifts us up from the gates of death, so that we may recount your praises in the gates of Zion. One of my commentaries points this out as a theme in this psalm: from the gates of death to the gates of Zion. God delivers us from oppression, from life or death circumstances, and is seen as one who has done this for his people and delivered them, so that they can rejoice in him as they come to worship on Mount Zion in the temple in Jerusalem. He concludes by saying that the nations have in fact defeated themselves. They dug a pit for the people of God, but they have fallen into the pit they have made. They have been caught up in the net that they have thrown for others. This was a characteristic we found in a previous psalm, maybe it was 7, where God prepared his bow and his sword, but didn't even have to use it because the nations wound up destroying themselves. We talked about what goes around comes around, or this whole idea of karma. But here the nations plot evil against the people of God, and the evil they plot falls against themselves. And this is because God has made God's self known. In verse 16, God has executed his judgment, and that's why the enemies defeat themselves. This is a part of God's plan, that the wicked are snared in the work of their own hands. In the end, he says the wicked will simply depart to the place of the dead, to Sheol, and that will happen to all the nations that forget God. All the nations that forget God will simply depart to the place of non-being, to the place of the dead in Sheol. But in contrast, the needy will not always be forgotten, nor the hope of the poor perish forever. That's in the liturgy of some of our churches, that we pray that God will not forget the needy, and the hope of the poor will not be taken away, because God is on the side of all who are oppressed, all who are afflicted, all who are poor and in need. As they turn and seek the Lord, God is their defender. And so the psalm ends with a couple of my favorite verses. Rise up, O Lord, don't let mere humans prevail. Humans can get angry and arrogant and think they are more powerful than they are. Nations, whole nations can get this way. Our nation has sometimes been this way. But the psalmist is looking at all the nations of the earth, and he's saying to the Lord, don't let mere mortals, what is man that you are mindful of him, right? Psalm 8. Don't let mere mortals prevail. Let the nations be judged before you, that is, execute your righteous judgment on all the nations. Put them in fear, Lord. Remember that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. Fear is a good thing to have. Here it may have the context of being afraid rather than the context of reverence. But we could read it in terms of reverence. Put all the nations in fear of you, O Lord, since you alone are God. Let the nations know that they are only human. Let the nations know that they are not divine, that they are not powerful gods. Defeat all of the nationalism that arises so that one nation fights against another nation, and no nation can be in peace. Let the nations know that they are merely mortal, that they are merely human. And that applies to us as well. Well, we will take up the rest of this one psalm divided into two parts next time. We'll do Psalm 10, and we'll also take up Psalm 11. I hope you have a great week. I hope the study on Psalms, especially your work in reading and studying the psalm itself and your commentary work, and if you're using the study questions, I hope that proves profitable. I hope these comments on the video are a kind of summary of what you've already studied and what you already know. Thanks be to God.